Good morning or afternoon, MECAG 114. Today for lab, we're going to do the internal components of our engine. And so this could be our crankshaft, piston, all those components. And so I'm going to show you how to do all of those steps so that you have an understanding of how these engines go back together. So the first thing you're going to want to do is make sure your parts are clean, and then we're going to lubricate the different components, and then we'll start installation. So we'll start off with lubricating the engine parts, and then we'll go from there. Okay. So first thing we're going to do is grease up all the journals, because prior to the engine starting, there's no lubrication around the bearings and journals. So the grease is there to kind of pre-lubricate all of the components. Once you get everything all lubricated, we're going to install the crankshaft into the engine block. Now it only goes in one way, and you got to remember which side is my PTO bearing and magneto bearing, and the magneto bearing or magneto journal will always go into the engine block. Right now I'm adding engine oil to the cylinder wall. That will help as far as installation of the piston, because once again there's no oil on that component as well. So it'll aid in piston installation and then kind of a pre-lubricant before the engine starts. So I'm installing the crankshaft now. And making sure that I put the throw of the crankshaft, that's where the piston is connected to, or connecting rod is connected to, towards the bottom. Okay. One thing I want to keep in mind is on my piston, on the connecting rod, will say mag side or PTO side. So I want to make sure that I put the mag side and install that connecting rod correctly. So if we look here, it says on the connecting rod, mag side or PTO, and that tells me which side the piston goes in. So right here is the mag side, and then that's the PTO side. So I'm going to use this tool, which is called a piston ring compressor. This compressor squeezes the rings to allow the piston to go into the cylinder wall. If we didn't have this tool, it would be really challenging to install the piston into the cylinder wall. So it's kind of like a sleeve that I'm just going to tighten up around the piston. I'm going to leave a little bit of the piston skirt open so that it gives me the ability to guide the piston into the cylinder. So once I install the piston or put the piston into the cylinder wall or into the cylinder, I'm going to take a hammer or something along those lines and tap my piston into the engine block so that it pops the piston all the way into the engine. Once the piston is installed, I'm going to align the connecting rod to the crankshaft. And sometimes you have to push the piston back out towards the opening just to be able to get the crankshaft to work its way around. Once I get the connecting rod to seat properly onto the crankpin bearing or crankpin journal, I'm going to grab the connecting rod cap, the oil dipper, and the screws, and I'm going to install the connecting rod cap. One thing to keep in mind is that hole needs to be facing towards the bottom, because that is where excess oil is released from the connecting rod. Connecting rod caps have to be installed a certain way. If you don't, it can cause the connecting rod cap to actually crack in half when you go to tighten it down. So after you hand tighten the bolts that go into the connecting rod, you have to get a torque wrench to torque down those bolts. The torque wrench that we're going to be using is a beam type torque wrench, and it reads based off of the pressure exerted onto the torque wrench and moves a needle across a gauge to tell you how tight it's going to be. We're going to be using a two-step method as far as torquing. So on this torque specification for this component is 100 inch-pounds. So we're going to torque each bolt to 50 inch-pounds, and then we're going to do a second torque to the remaining, which is 100 inch-pounds. And that allows for even pressure across both sides of the component, so that it tightens properly. Keep in mind, if you over tighten or over torque, you can break something. So you can break the bolt, you can break the connecting rod, or you can cause the engine to lock up or seize up. So after I get this all tightened up by hand, I'm going to get my torque wrench, and then I'm going to torque each of those bolts. Like I said before, I'm going to step up and torque one side at 50, and then I'm going to torque the other bolt at 50, and then I'm going to torque going to torque each of them at 100. So we look here, this is the beam type torque wrench, and that's the gauge I was talking about. That's going to read the torque that I'm putting on. So I'm going to make sure that I can get it tightened. I may have to move the components around to get the tool to work properly. And as I start to feel some tension into the tool or into the torque wrench, I'm going to look at that gauge and see that needle as it moves when I go to tighten it down. So if we look here, as I'm moving the torque wrench, you can see that I'm getting close to 50 inch-pounds. And I want to take it all the way to 50, and then I'm going to switch, or I'm going to continue on this until I get the 50 inch-pounds. I apologize for the shaky camera work. And then I'm going to switch, and I'm going to go to the other bolt, and I'm going to torque that at 50 inch-pounds as well. Once I get both bolts tightened to 50 inch-pounds, I'm going to go ahead and torque it to the final torque, which is 100 inch-pounds. Remember that torque is twisting force, so the amount of force I can put while I'm twisting the bolt is the actual measurement that I'm tightening it down, and that's what holds it in place. The manufacturer specifies the torque based on the fasteners or bolts and screws that you use, and how they're made, so that they're torqued at their correct measurement. So as I torque each bolt to 100 inch-pounds, one thing you want to do whenever you're reinstalling an engine is check to make sure that your piston is not locked up or seized. So it's all torqued up. And so you're going to turn your crankshaft and make sure that it can turn by hand and your piston is moving freely. Okay. Now I'm going to install the other components. The other components that we use are the camshaft and the tappets. I'm going to grease the journals of the camshaft. And the one thing about the camshaft is that it needs to be timed properly with the crankshaft. So after I get these things greased up, then I'll start the installation of the other internal components. The nice thing about greasing the tappets is it locks them in place during installation, and it just kind of puts a nice tight hold onto it. If we look here, this is a timing gear, and there's timing marks on that, and as well as the gear on the cam has a timing mark. And so when this all goes together, we want to make sure that those two marks align. There's a little keyway on the timing gear. That's what fits on the crankshaft to tell the gear where it needs to be. So we're going to put the timing gear on, and then we're going to install our tappets before we can put our camshaft in. So I take my tappets, they go in, and that's where my push rods will be installed to. And then I'm going to put my cam, install my cam, and make sure I'm aligned properly with the timing gear. And once they're all in and connected, I double check and make sure that those two marks are lined up, and that's how I know my valves are timed properly. Now I'm going to install the gasket to the crankcase cover. I like to put a little bit of grease on the part where the gasket goes to. That helps protect the gasket for when we go to take apart this engine. If you remember when you took apart the engine, it ripped a lot of those crankcase cover gaskets or side plate gaskets. And so we want to add a little bit of grease to it before we install the gasket. And hopefully next time when we go to install the components, we won't have to, or take apart the engine, we won't have to worry about the gasket falling apart. Okay. Hopefully I'll have all these engines back together before next fall, so that the next class can just get to work. So if we look here, my gasket's in place. Now I'm ready to install my crankcase cover. So the first thing I want to do is look and make sure that my governor crank is towards the back of the engine. If it's up towards the front like that, it can cause damage to those components. So that governor crank sits on the governor gear, and whenever the engine spins, it causes, that's what actually slows down the engine to prevent it from overspeeding. The timing gear also connects to that idler gear, and all that does is turn my governor crank or my governor gear to help as far as slowing the engine down. So before I put my crankcase cover on, I'm going to grease my PTO journal and make sure that that's lubed up properly, so that when I go to install this, it goes on easily. And then also so that there's lubrication on that bearing surface. So as I go to put it on, my gears are going to bind up a little bit. So I want to turn my crankshaft, and it allows the teeth of the gears to line up and allows me to put my crankcase cover on properly. So I'm going to take the bolts and I'm going to hand tighten them all in. And this also requires a torque. Now, the repair manual also says that this torque for the crankcase cover bolt is 100 inch-pounds. So we're also going to two-step this torque and start with 50 and then go to 100 inch-pounds. So I can hand tighten it, or I can lightly tighten it with a ratchet. I just want to be careful that I don't over tighten those bolts. So, once again, using my beam torque wrench, I'm going to go ahead and torque in an alternating pattern to allow for the crankcase cover to be tightened evenly. So each bolt is going to be tightened to 50 inch-pounds. Once I tighten everything down to 50, I'll go back through and tighten everything to 100 inch-pounds. So now I'm done with my 50. Now I'm going to start going at 100 inch-pounds and make sure everything is tightened up properly. As I finish up torquing the crankcase cover, I want to make sure that everything is proper after being done torqued. So I'm going to flip the engine up, and I'm going to rotate the crankshaft and make sure that everything moves freely by hand. and that my piston is moving up and down in the cylinder properly, just like so. And that's how we do the internal components of our small engine.